All right, let's start our conversation, Martin. So, just as short introduction, my name is Björn Winiger, and I'm an independent consultant. I primarily work with leaders in organizations on leadership development, executive team development, and organizational development. Helping leaders to lead better, helping teams to collaborate in a better way, and also helping organizations to develop their culture and the way they work. And I reach out to you, Martin, to have this conversation, and maybe you can just quickly say hello and who you are.
Yeah, happy and thanks for inviting me to this conversation. It's very exciting to explore something new for me. So I'm a German born and raised person, human who moved to the United States to California in 95. And I'm a father and ex-husband. And when my second marriage ended, became very curious about male-female relationships because this dating scene and relating scene in Northern California was very different from what I had learned and adopted from my parents and in my German culture. And so that through getting to know Ken Wilber's work of integral philosophy and also working with Eckhart Tolle as a group facilitator or training with him led me to write a book called Integral Relationships, a Manual for Men. And it was really a manual for me because I wanted to understand all the multiple facets of male female love relationships. And it turned out that also same-sex couples and all the variations found the book quite helpful. And then a few years later, I also got really interested in what is our purpose as human beings and what is love from an integral perspective. So the first book was mainly about relating, right? I always said love is unconditional, relationships are not. But even though that's a catchy slogan, I think love is also conditional unless we go into the ultimate sphere of some kind of transcendent state of consciousness. And so my second book is called Sex, Purpose, Love. So sex in the sense of gender. And yeah, so here I am, and what I do now, finally full time after leaving the corporate world, is that I'm a integral relationship author and workshop leader. I really love to uh, host and lead and facilitate in-person workshops, which of course was interrupted during Corona, and um, and also a consultant. So I've been teaching a lot online, people from around the world in the last 18 months, and transitioning right now back into more in-person stuff. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Martin. And there's one thing we share is that we both no longer live in the country we grew up in. So me being Swedish or half Swedish,
Mhm.
having grown
Yeah.
up in Stockholm, but living in Switzerland for 40 years now.
No.
And another thing we share is that we're both interested in using integral informed or integral theories in our work.
Mhm.
Taking a stage maturity perspective as we're working with people, um, and I'm sure we'll find many similarities as well. Yet many viewers of this might think, so, what is a leadership developer in corporations having a chat with someone who is really interested in intimate relationships?
Mhm.
What is this talk going to be about? And and the reason why I reached out to you, Martin, is because I've read your book. I've listened to some of your other podcasts and interviews with others, primarily because I was interested in how I can develop in my intimate relationship with my wife,
Mhm.
and how we together can develop as a couple. And first of all, I can say super helpful. There's a lot in there that has inspired me and inspired us to work on our relationship. And then I suddenly had this thought, because as I'm working with large corporates, one thing that I don't think I know any corporation that is at the moment not interested in this gender equality question. So all the corporates I work with are thinking about diversity and inclusion on different levels and different areas. So this can be diversity in age, in ethnicity, in culture, etc. Of course, also the importance of LGBTI, so the inclusion of different ways of relating and or sexual orientation, etc. But one thing that has been around for maybe even a little bit longer with the feminist movement is this question: how do we deal with gender equality? And all organizations that I'm working with are thinking about how can we encourage more women into senior leadership. How do we help them develop? How do we, integrate that? And I would say all of them struggle with that. It's a very hard, difficult thing to do. So there are different things that organizations come up with, and then I just had this thought that probably, or maybe, this is a hypothesis that we'll be exploring today. Maybe in this whole question of how do we help organizations to be more gender balanced, especially in senior leadership, because the balance is there at lower ranks of organizations in almost any company. But how can we approach this maybe differently, and how can the work that you are doing, Martin, in thinking deeply about how men and women relate, how can that inform this process that the organizations are in to become more gender balanced? So that would be the topic for today. And I feel this urge to kind of place a disclaimer right now, because I'm very conscious that we are two white males in a certain age bracket, no longer the absolute youngest, that you and I are talking about this topic, which in itself maybe is not, might have a certain bias, or it's I just want to acknowledge that we are two white men talking about this in this conversation. I don't think that's a problem, but I think it's worth just mention the awareness of that.
Yeah, thank you for presencing that, as we New Agers say.
Yeah. And the second thing, maybe, I'm also very aware. I notice that with this topic of gender equality in organizations, and especially in senior leadership, we are entering a very complex territory.
Yeah.
And we're also entering a very charged territory that is very emotionally and politically charged. And I've come into the conversation to kind of hold my views lightly, so and to explore openly and see where this leads us. So maybe to hand over to you a little bit. So what is because I have my experience working with leaders, both male and females, and leadership teams who are mixed. There are very few exclusively male or female leadership teams that I work with. Usually they're mixed in some composition, and I have my experiences. But before I go into that, I'm just curious. So sort of from your perspective, as you are working with people, but maybe also with organizations, and what is your take on gender equality in organizations and in leadership.
So very intuitively, just listening to you for the first time, it struck me that this term gender equality sounds inappropriate to me or unrealistic to me, right? Because
Mm,
we're assuming, if we don't differentiate this further, right, that we are in a way equal, and that we're not different. And I think by time, and I assume this is very often so like the approach, right? So like a radical feminist, that radical feminists may take, right? But even I think so like the most advanced feminists, they recognize that there are biological differences and other differences, um, and we're living definitely on the edge of evolution, and it never happened in human history, as far as I know, right? That we had these equal opportunities, right? And um, but that doesn't mean that there is equality in the sense. And um, one thing that struck me a few years ago, you being from Scandinavia, from Sweden, which is arguably the most gender neutral, let's say, country, that females
mm,
there, once given the total opportunities to pick what profession they want to choose, that a large majority chooses typical female-oriented professions. Right? We only see in emerging cultures that females often then choose male-oriented professions because it gives them potentially more income and more status and things like that. But once we take that away, we already see that there is still, gender differences. And so I think it's probably helpful from an integral perspective to acknowledge, where our inherent biological and maybe deeply socially constructed and sometimes by necessity differences, and also where do we need to deconstruct differences. So I mean, that would be so like my approach to this.
yeah.
Right.
So you're already
Yeah.
touching upon something. So if you look at the different types and waves of feminism, one crucial distinction is difference feminism and equity feminism. And
Mhm.
difference feminism, which says men and women are different, psychologically and emotionally and biologically, and
Mhm.
therefore, because of these differences, that has different consequences. And equity feminism, which says that actually men and women are not different; they are the same, especially um, psychologically, emotionally, etc., and that the differences are only socialized.
Mhm.
And there and difference feminism is not en vogue these days. It's kind of marginalized. So most feminism is in this equity feminism box. But what are we? So I'm curious. What do you think? So by reducing to equity feminism, what are we losing? But also maybe what does equity feminism bring to the table? So if we're creating a integral view where we assume everyone is partially right. So what's
Yeah. Yeah.
important about understanding difference feminism versus equity feminism that could help us in this conversation?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always very interested when there is a dialectic, right, between thesis and antithesis, or like in a Hegelian sense, what is the synthesis, assuming that both sides have a limited view, right? And I think this is also really an emergent topic. We, unlike with other issues, we cannot look back and draw from history. We need to sort of like lay the tracks as the train moves forward, or we maybe that's the best metaphor, right? So even a conversation like that is exploratory for me, right? Is to say what can come out of our dialogue, and maybe then out of a broader dialogue with females as well. So
Yeah.
maybe to give a bit of a framework that I'm working with, and I actually just had, we have this 26-week training, and one exercise we do, and I do this for 10 years in my workshops, is this where we separate the males and the females into two groups, and they both get the same questions. And what they explore is, from their perspective, and of course that these people are usually relatively evolved in consciousness, what are biological givens and differences that the females would say, are givens, and what do the males see as givens? And that's already often interesting, that males think of different things than females think of. Like, males for often don't even think about that women have the capacity to give birth. So there is like a collective male shadow, I would say, in 70% or more, right? When we ask what are the biological differences, males don't think about it. Women usually early on mention that capacity, mention menstrual cycles, which men usually don't think about as a biological difference, right? And then more the obvious things around physical strength, and also hormones are sometimes mentioned, right, in the hormonal differences of testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, how females release different hormones under stress, and then have different strategies to deal, with stressful situations and things like that. So just having that conversation, and I'll briefly say what the other things are, then I ask them. So they get all the questions, and they do that separately. What are learned gender roles, right? What is conditioned? And so I think that's a first very important differentiation to make. And it's not so important here to say who's right or wrong, but let's say we would be in a managerial context, and there would be a team that tries to have, so like, work on gender equality, to use that word that I just learned I don't like, right? I would first do that exercise with them, and then separate them and say,
Yeah.
is there, where are we, depending on our level of consciousness and our particular biases, what in this group of people is sort of like, is there even a consensus that these biological differences impact us in certain ways, right? And then the next difference, and just interrupt me because I'm going to go into this long lecture here. So
Yeah, no,
please just
it's
say,
super interesting. Please go on.
yeah. And so the next question is, what are learned gender roles, right? And so that's obviously
Yeah.
things like, how do we dress, and who approaches, romantic contacts, and who buys the diamond ring, and these things. And they are, of course, very fluid, but still people may have preferences, right? A lot of women may say, well, I like it if men approach me, and then I have the choice to say yes or no, right? And I don't want to be the one who has to be active and approach a man, for example. Even though I could do that, I have a preference, and I know it's socially constructed. But let's be also open. What kind of learned gender roles do we still appreciate? Right? Some women like it when men open doors for them, or car doors, right? And some women don't like
Mhm.
it. And just to see that this is like, all women should not like to have the door open for them, or have it open for them. That's stupid. That's just like, you know, uh, some people then would basically impose their values onto others. But if you have a leadership team with, let's say, 10 men and 10 women, maybe 5 women would say, I like it if the doors are open for me, and the other 5 women say, I don't like it. And there is no point in saying, oh, we should all agree on, and I'm just using very simple examples here, right? On the same thing, which is just recognize that some men like to be approached by women, and other men like to be more the hunter, and and things like that. So this
Mhm.
is so like a very simple exercise, but I'm often surprised how long the males and the females in the group just spend, and that a lot of them never even had that conversation with anyone, right? They never
Yeah.
had this kind of conversation, this exploration, and they see the complexity, right? The other day somebody said, well, beards are not really biological. In males, they're they're so like conditioned because women selected males with stronger beards because they have more testosterone, and somehow even that was somehow socially constructed, right? Even though it took hundred thousands of years. So we already see the complexity there. Um, and
Yeah.
then more in the
There's a,
relational. Go ahead.
no,
Go ahead.
I was curious because I just heard talk to someone recently who said they did a similar exercise with leaders. So they
Mm-hmm.
separated men and women, and they asked both the group of men and the group of women what is male leadership and what is female leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And they made lists of how they see the difference in leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and they came back and compared, and it was kind of more, more or less similar.
Mm-hmm.
And then the interesting thing was that uh, because they were then looking at the list, looking at what is admired leadership or socially
Mm-hmm.
desirable leadership, and that
Mm-hmm.
there were suddenly differences. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, that
Mm-hmm.
and there's also a lot of research on if a you know if a man or a male leader is assertive, people admire that and go, wow, that's a
Yeah.
strong leader. And then when a woman
Mm-hmm.
is assertive, it very quickly is viewed negatively as, oh, she's so aggressive. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really where what you're doing with your groups and what we do with leaders, where there's this connect. And I'm just curious, let's say there are these differences, and it's viewed differently in terms of admiration and social desirability. How do we deal with that?
Yeah. So I would put this more into the domain of what we call feminine masculine polarities. But ultimately, some males, and again, that depends on how mature they are, and this is why this becomes so complex, they feel threatened, right, by women who are leading. I'm not sure if women also feel threatened by females who are strong leaders or have strong masculine energy. So that would be a question I don't know, right? Uh, in norm,
There's maybe I can answer
Mhm.
that partially. So
Yeah.
what I read a study where men were asked, would you rather be like to be led by a man or a male or a female boss? And the
Hmm. Hmm.
majority of men said, I'd rather be led by a male boss. And then asking women the same
Hmm.
question. And again, most of them would say, I prefer a male boss.
Hmm.
And that
Yeah.
I find very interesting. And I'm really curious, why do from all your, research and studies and experience with female male polarities, well, what's your explanation for that?
Um, I think the underlying issue around that has to do with this primal emotional reaction under stress or fear in females, and ultimately trusting that a male, when push comes to shove, would go naturally, right? We know that's a natural impulse of males to protect and potentially to provide. There have been tons of studies that you probably know when there's like a life or death situation. Instinctively, the male comes to the rescue, specifically of females and children, right, without thinking, while women shout out for help or call for help, because males are the disposable sex. We're the ones who, sacrifice traditionally ourselves in wars and in dangerous work situations or situations. And I think there is some underlying unconscious dynamic there. And a lot of that is unconscious. And until we talk about it and make it and presence it, right, bring it into our conscious awareness, these answers are given from these basic primal differences. And so we're not conditioned yet. I mean, again, here, what is biology and what is conditioning? That's sort of like a woman would ultimately sacrifice herself for the success of the team or defend the team as a male would. And I think that plays a role in that. I mean, in Germany, of course, we had Angela Merkel, and in the UK we had Margaret Thatcher and things like that. But in the United States, for example, we obviously see that there's more female voters than male voters statistically, because women get older than males. And so, if all women would unite and would elect female leaders, then we would have all female politicians. And that's baffled sometimes politicians like Hillary Clinton and others, that they often get, as you just said, a relatively small number of female voters, right? So, yeah, so I think the
Right.
biology is what underlies that. And then so one module that we look at, and I don't want to jump forward too quickly, is something called the fear-shame downward spiral or fear-shame dynamic. That I think plays a huge role also in leadership situations. But I just want to quickly finish, the other questions that we ask. And again, our questions are around romantic relationships, but basically,
Yeah.
what do you struggle most with the opposite sex? What pain has the opposite sex created for you? What would you like the opposite sex to know what it means to be your gender? And again, these questions sound so trivial, and I continue to be blown away. It just happened a few hours ago, where people in our age range who are therapists and very evolved people say, wow, that was really interesting. And I, hearing from a collective of males and females that they all nod their head and says, yeah, really, we go into these fear reactions, we go into this is what we struggle with, create so much empathy all of a sudden and so much connection. And again, here we're seeing differences, right? We're acknowledging differences. It's not about, oh, we should all feel the same and think the same and be the same. And then we also say, what makes the opposite attractive to you and what do you appreciate about the opposite sex? And then we do one last question I find super fascinating, is to say, how do you think the world would look, and how would you as an individual feel if the opposite sex would completely disappear from one moment to the next from the planet? And there would only be males, for the males, and only females for the females. And I think on a deeper level, that often creates sort of like not only an appreciation for the other sex, but also how much our identity, our self-identity and our behavior is guided by the fact that the other sex exists, right? And so this is like my first step in unpacking this whole issue around biology and gender and the complexity of it. And then we can, of course, also see, depending on the level of consciousness development, which we haven't talked or explained to people who don't know what that
Right.
means, and maybe you want to do that, how people approach these questions and their views, they're also changing. And so, just to briefly say, when we have a majority of people who are what we call at the transpersonal level, so like that goes beyond just the conditioned self, there is an easy acceptance that there are differences, and there is a deep appreciation for the synergy that is created because out of these differences, right? And at earlier levels of consciousness, this appreciation is usually not there, right? There it is like either, like we felt we need to say, oh, we're two white males, and or there's a lot of conflict or a lot of tension, or at earlier levels of consciousness, people often say, but we have no problem. There is no problem. I'm in
Yeah.
Turkey now for 3.5 years, and there early on there was quite a group of people who wanted to work with me, and one of the leading females said, "Well, Martin, I mean, this is not so complicated. My husband works in the pharmaceutical industry. I have a BMW with a private driver. We live in a beautiful home. I'm raising our children, and my husband makes the money. And why is there a problem? This is how it should be, right? This is how relationships
Mhm.
work." And I mean, like, I just felt like, right? This was like, where did I come to? And I said, I don't think we can do this together because I have a very different
Uh,
picture, right, of having three daughters that are now adults, and one is a management consultant, one is a doctor, right, and one lives in Berlin, manages a restaurant, right. I mean, I come from a very different background, and so
yeah.
we see that the levels of consciousness development and often cultures, very much, and in company cultures, as we talked a little bit earlier, I think really have a huge impact on how these questions are approached, and that needs to be taken into consideration. But for me, the beauty is when we acknowledge that, and there is this wonderful, wow, we really need each other, right? Our energies, our differences, to create a synergy to solve the significant problems that we're facing in organizations and in politics and in the world at large. And it makes me sad that often that doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe at this point, Martin, we can say just a little bit about stage development.
Mhm.
So because that's important in both your and my work,
Yeah.
um, and maybe primarily suggest if you're interested in stage maturity, to Google or read some things from the integral world. Ken Wilber comes up when it comes to stage maturity in leadership. Torbert is a good source.
Mhm.
But very shortly, what we're referring to when we talk about stage maturity is a research that started in the 40s, 50s of the last century, and so many people who got interested in how do adults develop, and what's going on there, and because after Jean Piaget's work, looking at how children develop over four stages that he described, which is pretty much universally accepted today as yes, this is how children develop.
Mhm.
There was a view in the 40s that once a child reaches that fourth stage, they are adult and that's it. And
Mhm.
and so in the decades after that, a lot of different researchers have looked into how adults develop. And indeed, what they all discovered is that adults do develop over many more stages, and they can be described. They can also be measured or assessed, and we see how adults develop over these stages in a inclusive and transcendent way. So it's always we're going through a stage of development and we're integrating that, and we're developing to the next stage of development, but we're taking what we've gone through with us. And as such, they are also linear in the way that we go through them in sequence. We cannot jump over a stage. So there's a lot about that, and why it's helpful, I think, both in your work and my work, is to because the on every stage that an adult currently has their center of gravity in, informs them on how they see the world and how they see themselves and how they see themselves interact with that world. how they interpret why the world works the way it does. And they put very different meanings or attach very different meanings to phenomena based on where they're coming from. And it just makes it easier to help people develop, because when we do the kind of development we do, so you working with individuals and couples who want to grow in their relationship, and me working with individuals and teams who want to grow in their leadership and teamwork, it's very useful to understand where they're coming from, because they will have a certain view, as you just explained, on relationships. What's a good relationship will change as people develop through stages. And equally so, people who are leading an organization or a team will define good leadership in a very different way depending on what stage they are coming from. Would that be a fair summary of stage maturity development,
that's
Martin?
a nice introduction. Yes.
And maybe the disclaimer is there's much more to integral theory. There's also different lines of development where it can be at different stages. There's also quadrants. So what area of experience are we focusing on, and so on. So here's the curiosity then. So going back a little bit to and I don't know what to call it anymore, Martin, because I know gender equality is the term that business corporations use, right?
Yeah.
But maybe we can call it gender diversity. But this question of and here's a curiosity I have. This question of that these corporates I work with are posing is, how can we ensure that we have more female senior leaders in our organization? And the first of all, what I can say is there's a lot of research that's happened in recent years on what the impact is. And purely from a financial perspective, and it was one of the big consultancy firms. They did a study that showed that companies who have a more gender diverse senior leadership are economically much more successful than companies who do not have. So there's a desirability in there. There's also, rightly so, I think, a desire from women to say, we would like to have a seat at those tables. And what I'm curious about is, because you were talking so nicely about how when you do these exercises with men and women, this deep appreciation for the other polarity. You know, how men say we deeply appreciate female energies and the female polarity, and vice versa. And I'd be very curious to hear what leaders would say. And I've never done this, and I've never heard anyone doing it. But to what extent, as I perceive leaders in a way quite homogeneous in their views on leadership, and how do we take decisions, how do we discuss matters, how do we relate, etc., whether the appreciation is already there, or maybe that could be a possible route to create more embracing this idea more. And I'd like to share a short story, and I'm curious what you think. So I had a conversation with a very senior woman at a financial institution in Switzerland. And it wasn't a coaching per se, but we had just a very personal conversation. And as the conversation progressed, she said the following. She said, "Listen, Björn, every day at work, I have to be someone I'm not. I have to pretend. I have to adapt the ways of the boys."
Yeah.
And I asked her, or I just commented, that sounds extremely exhausting. And in that moment, she broke down in tears,
Yeah,
and she said, "It's so exhausting.
yeah,
I have to pretend every day that I'm someone else
mhm,
than I actually feel I am,
yeah,
just to fit into this very male-dominated executive leadership
yeah,
team."
yeah.
And it made me very sad. And I'm curious to hear from you, about male, female polarities, etc. Why have we ended up there, and what do we need to do about it?
Yeah, yeah. So I just want to also emphasize that not only, when we do this exercise, that males and females see where they can synergize and appreciate each other, they also hear where they struggle and usually never talk about it.
Mm,
And to put the males and the females into these separate groups gives them license to among themselves say, yeah, that's what
yeah,
we're struggling with, and then just one person reporting, so it's kind of anonymous. So it's it's both, that the
right.
appreciation but also the struggles. And this, uh, from my perspective and experience, uh, our biology, we think of the human brain, right? And most people think, oh, this whole thing up there is like the human brain, but only the outer layer of the neocortex is really uniquely human, right? Everything else is we share with most mammals, like, to keep it simple, right? And this transition of this gender equality, maybe, that will be replaced at one point with the term gender synergy, for example, I would like, right?
That's a
uh,
nice term, Martin.
yeah. Um, this happened so fast that biology probably would need 10, 100,000 years to adapt to that, if ever, right? And so, since we're denying basically our biological primary impulses, and it's not politically correct to talk about these things, and I think the Me Too movement, which is very important, right? But it has even more stifled that basic communication or conversation that I think we would have to address that. Um, is sort of like an underlying issue. And with that, I mean, um, and there are, of course, studies by Donald Simmons and David Buss and Salomon is a woman, around our different sexual desires and our different mating behaviors. And they run basically this undercurrent, right? Um, that most women, just as men want sexy women, right, with good reproductive capabilities. And I'm not saying something new here, right? But I'm saying something that is usually not discussed in the corporate world, right? Is
Of
that
course, no,
men, that's a taboo,
yeah, that's
right?
actually a no-go area to
Yeah,
talk
that's a
about.
no-go
Yeah.
area. And so, what this fear shame dynamic in a way means is that when men actually show weaknesses, right, or are not success driven or successful, show that there's like at the top of the pack, we just know that, even though women say, well, that's not true, right? But when push comes to shove, right, it's just still a fact of life that if you're successful and wealthy as a male, you have access to the females that you sexually desire. And even if you say, well, no, I love my wife for her character and for all kinds of qualities, she just happens to be also, very physically attractive, right? Or I love my man. I would still love him if he would if he would have been totally poor or something like that. And this just doesn't bear out any kind of study that has been done, on dating websites and looking what our mating behavior is. It's still 200,000 years old or 100,000 years old. And
Mm.
to expect that to change just because we are embarrassed to admit it, like, it's just like silly. And I'm not giving now hundreds of examples, but if we look at on business travelers when they go to their hotel rooms, what kind of movies they watch. We see that porn is basically the number one by far what males watch, right? In some romantic comedies where there's usually a successful male who in the end rescues heroically the female is what females watch, right? And that doesn't even change, when we evolve more. So as long as we're in denial around that, I think it's very, very hard to address this issue. And so, males coming back to this difficulty that makes me really sad, right? That a woman in this patriarchal world, which there still is, right, or male-dominated world, can succeed in a leadership role if she adopts basically the male behavior and denies her own authentic self, right? Where Carol Gilligan, I think, wrote a very important book called In a Different Voice, which is often mentioned in integral circles and which literally gave me sleepless nights. And also there is a book called Female Authority that I want to talk about just for a moment, right? Males, we still can live out our own biologically driven behaviors and by and large get rewarded by what we desire most, which is sex and being with females who support us and admire us and support us in our purpose, while females, right, now is the big question, the old gender role of mother and caretaker and supporter of her partner husband, and marrying up like women marry up in income, social status, etc. That falls apart more and more, but there is no new identity really for females created other than being stuck in the old role or adapting to the male, kind of like what this woman said, and that's, that this can only be solved in co-creation between males and females, again by, in my opinion, not denying our biological givens, or at least conditioning
Hmm.
that has happened over 100,000 years, while saying what can we reasonably transcend. And I'm not, I wish there would be a world where females would choose males who are less aggressive and less destructive to the environment and, all these things. But that's just not the reality in 80 or 90% of the cases. And I think this plays into the corporate world and why we don't have this gender synergy yet, because this always underlies it. And if I can tell a
I,
little story, right, around, and it's a made up story, right? But there was this manager, and one day he realizes that he makes 30% more than a female uh, in this company who has a similar position in a different department. And of course, he immediately goes to the HR department and says, "Please cut my salary, right? And give it to this woman. This is not right. She should make as much as I make." And then he goes home to his wife and he's very excited and proud of himself and says, what I did today, we both believe in gender equality. I had my salary cut by 30%. I gave back the Mini that you drive that we can no longer afford. I took the children out of private school, right? And I canceled our trip to the Bahamas. And I'm sure you're totally supportive of that I did this, right? In the name of, and the wife, of course, go like, "Are you fucking crazy?" Right? So,
yeah,
and I think this is
yeah.
a real issue, right? That we need to acknowledge.
So yeah, I do think it's a real issue, and I do think it plays into it, and there's this high pressure on men to be successful in business, and being successful in business, of course, also not only but also translates into a leadership career. So
Yeah.
there's this high pressure, and I also, if I look at couples that I know, a male surgeon being married to a female nurse is very common. The
Hmm.
other way around, I don't think I could name one.
Hmm.
Or and the same in business, and it's almost the cliche, the male CEO who has a relationship with the executive assistant and so on. But
Yeah.
but I hardly ever see that the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so but now the question is, okay, so as I'm working with organizations and with women, and I think also with men who want to redefine the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how can we both be conscious about these male female polarities and say, okay, yeah, so a large percentage of our brain is mammal brain, and there's
Yeah.
certain programming,
Yeah.
and at the same time say, well, as modern, postmodern people, we want to transcend that, and we want
Yeah.
to create an organization together where female employees feel, wow, I have a perspective and I can lead in my way, and I can be successful. And right now, that's very hard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with the example of this woman I talked to, that I just talked about, she said, I had to become someone else to be successful, and I had to be smarter than
Yeah.
all my male
Yeah.
colleagues. I
Yeah.
had to work harder,
Yes.
and this is, I think, something that's everybody agrees on. Let's find a way to change that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet, what it doesn't seem to be working very well. So there are certain measures, with quotas or with special development programs for
Yeah.
female leaders, etc. And there's pros and cons probably for
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
them. And there's also something interesting, a story I can tell. So my wife, she's a professional musician. She's a cellist, and traditionally, big orchestras would be mostly men.
Yeah.
And what they started to do is to have blind auditions. So if they were looking for a new flutist or cellist
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
pianist, they would have them play in front of a curtain or behind the curtain,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the candidates would be judged only by how they played. They even later on, and that's when they did that, the shift was dramatic. Dramatic shift in proportion of male and female musicians in
Yeah.
orchestras.
Yeah.
And I heard anecdotally, and I think that's interesting. They said, well, we even had to ask candidates to take off their shoes as they were entering the stage, because subconsciously,
Yeah.
the people selecting the musician would hear
Yeah.
the steps of a woman or the steps of a man.
Yeah.
But isn't that, and I think there's something going on there, that we want to change, and yet we're struggling with it.
Yeah. But I think the real question is, how many male and female conductors do we have? Right? Because
yeah,
that's a more communal thing to play in an orchestra, right? But leading an orchestra, conducting an orchestra, that is a different role, and so that would be an additional interesting question.
Yeah.
So
that's the equivalent to the leadership roles in
Yeah.
corporations.
Yeah.
But what are your views on how to help organizations change this, taking all this into account that we're talking about?
And of course, I'm also sensitive of time here. So one thing we look explicitly at is this fear-shame dynamic, right? That under stress, females have a tendency to go into fear and seek connection and protection, right, with others, and males go into shame and usually then retreat and, eventually, in extreme cases, kill themselves because they can no longer handle the shame, and often become very aggressive then to build this wall around hiding their shame, right? While females are often don't, have to hide their feelings, and probably in the corporate world they have to do too. But this is a biological differences that we should acknowledge. And the next differentiation I I think is very important to make is to differentiate the unfortunate naming of feminine and masculine polarities, that masculine sounds like male and feminine sounds like female, right? And the recognition that at higher levels of consciousness, we can actually learn and practice that females, and a lot of more females have to do that, to develop masculine traits and qualities, and males eventually can develop feminine traits and qualities. And you may want to then put this in this image here in the video, but I show it here real quick too.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
traditionally we see that females are socialized to be more feminine at earlier stages of development, and then as Eric Fromm wrote in the Art of Loving in 1956, at the orange rational stage, start to integrate their masculine, while males are still in their masculine. And I think in the corporate world, we see a lot by necessity, everything from here down, right? So we see maybe in lower level positions or at earlier levels of development, the males being accepted and expected to be masculine, the females feminine. And now the females, as this woman described, said, I need to be masculine in order to survive in that world. And what hasn't really happened on a large scale, and is not very good for corporations, is when males then in the green stage, the pluralistic stage, sensitive self stage, swing over to their feminine side to integrate their feminine, which sometimes is called a midlife crisis, and very broadly speaking, or they're called sensitive New Age guys, or in German, Warmduscher und Weicheier. We have a lot of derogatory terms, snacks,
yeah,
sensitive New Age guys, right? They're not very, very well respected, but they're about 10% of the population, while females are still on this journey of strengthening their so-called feminine power, which is really female power and not feminine power. It's a misnomer. And what we're looking for, and what I'm mainly working on, is up here, where males and females feel very comfortable in embodying, now that they both, right, been on either side of the feminine masculine,
right.
to embody their feminine masculine. And importantly, another differentiation we need to make is that there is healthy masculine and unhealthy, or what's called toxic masculine. And that's also true for the feminine. We very often have to, like, specifically at that 6 green level, this idea that everything feminine is good and everything masculine is bad. Right?
Right,
And
right.
even males feel a lot of shame and feel they need to apologize for all the pain and harm they have done to women and children and the planet and things like that, right? And lose sort of like this. And the females often elevate, themselves into victims who are now, it's sort of like payback time. And again, there is a lot of pain there, a lot of wounding, and and I think in the corporate, so the trick is, how do we get into the sixth and then into the higher levels of consciousness development, where males, and for me, feminine, masculine, maybe I need to briefly explain, it's like we use hula hoops, and maybe you've done exercises like that, where one person is inside the hula hoop with eyes closed, and the outside person is just pushing or leading them, if you will, guiding them through the room, right? You have a room full
Mhm,
of people doing
mhm.
that. And then you do the same thing with eyes opened, right? Where there is a contact. And then you have both outside the hoop, and they're taking turns in leading and following. And they realize if
Right.
they both try to lead at the same time or follow at the same time, you get stasis, right? You get stagnation, or you get kind of
Yeah.
chaos. And then there's a fourth phase where they let a hoop lead them. And it's just astonishing how males and females sometimes easily can lead and follow and enjoy both. And some can only lead, some only can follow, feel very uncomfortable, or the person inside who's supposed to follow doesn't follow. They just don't surrender because they don't trust the leader, or they're so tired that they no longer want to be pushed around or led by others. And we also do an exercise where we have a table on one end of the room and pillows on the other side of the room. And then where people move alone, agentic, right, by moving by their own choice. And in the other area, they hold hands and dance to the music and move. And then we ask people to move into what felt most resonant or most comfortable for them, to walk around alone or in the group, or lay in the pillows right down on the floor in fetal position, or stand on the table. And these things can only be experienced, right? So that they cannot really be intellectualized. And it's always amazing, at least in my workshops, that there is always a mix of males and females who stand on the table, are in the agentic, the communal, or the pillow pile, right, in that context. And once we separate this male, feminine, masculine from male and female, and just see it as this ascending, descending, agentic, communal polarities, which we need all four for functioning organizations, at least
Yeah.
from an integral perspective, right? And we see that this can be dissociated from gender, right? Because here I'm very adamant that feminine, masculine is not associated with gender. Then we
Yeah.
would move more into this more holarchic or more fluid systems where we can really appreciate both perspectives, and then males could be in their feminine, and females wouldn't then feel, oh, I can no longer trust him because he's like too soft, right? He's not potentially not protecting and providing because he's too communal. And males would feel threatened by females who would stand on the table, let's say, right, and see the bigger
Yeah.
picture and be in a leader
Yeah.
position, but would also say, hey, in this case, in this situation, I want to take on more a feminine position and lead and leave the masculine to you, and let's avoid the unhealthy expressions of the feminine, the masculine. And I think these conversations, these exercises, these insights, I would assume they're not very prevalent or common in the corporate world. To
Yeah,
make
indeed.
these
So,
differentiations, right? To say what is
yeah.
biology, what is gender, what is our fear, shame, deeply conditioned reaction, and what do we really need is feminine, masculine synergy in co-creation and leading
I love
teams
that,
and
Martin.
co-creating teams.
Yeah, and it's almost like an ending statement, because I think what we've explored is these differences, men, women, etc. But we're kind of arriving at a synthesis where we look at this more in a more differentiated way.
Hmm.
And what I also love about what you just said is certain things we need to experience, right? So what I'm taking with me from that is, okay, so how can I create more spaces to experience and explore this? And this has been an important insight for me, is that at the moment, the companies I work with, they are not creating these spaces for this conversation. And probably if we did a few of those exercises with some
Hmm.
of these leaders, we would probably quite quickly find common ground, find appreciation for each
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
from any side. We would relax into understanding, yeah, maybe some things are biological, some things are maybe socialized,
Hmm.
uh, and some things may show up more in women and may show up more in men, but there's a fluidity which is also influenced by stage development,
Hmm.
and the orange integration of the masculine and the green integration of the feminine.
Yeah.
And if we had those conversations, and if we had the courage to have those conversations, we could probably do a lot of good for gender synergies in senior leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, whenever we do that, thank you so much for summarizing it so beautifully. whenever we do the feminine masculine exercise in our training, I just like feel so deeply how badly we need this, not only in our one-on-one relationships, but in the media, in politics, in corporations. I mean, this is a real existential question for the future of humanity. And I often feel, man, we only spend 2 hours on that. That deserves so much more time. Um, and yeah, and along with that, again, as we both emphasize, is how do we need a stage development in order for this to happen, that up here, which looks a little strange, where males and females both can embody these feminine masculine polarities.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's there's a lot of material to absorb from the integral fields, and hopefully people will get curious to understand. Well, what does that mean
yeah, yeah,
with
yeah, yeah,
all the lines up there? But it's very fulfilling, and
mhm,
and as you say, I think it's important. I also, by the way, have two daughters,
mm,
14 and 19,
mm,
and of course my primary work is with corporations and
mm,
helping them develop, but I also have a deep curiosity and interest, to shape the corporate world in a way that my daughters would feel that
yeah,
they can flourish in.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm really so grateful for my three daughters again, who were all educated in America. I want to put in one more little plug, just because,
Yeah,
not
please.
because you're in Switzerland, but a few years ago, I was interested how males and females develop differently, and somebody pointed out a book to me called Female Authority by two Jungian Harvard-trained psychologists, Florence Wiedemann and Polian Eisentrath. The latter wrote some other um, books on archetypes and feminism. And what really blew my mind is to see. So they have a developmental system of 4/5 stages. This insight for me as a man, how women up to the third stage define their self identity, um, basically through males, to their father and other male figures, and in this patriarchal world. And there is in the fourth stage, which also Karen Gilligan wrote in a different voice about. I mentioned that book now twice. Uh, that females now increasingly try to find their own voice outside the patriarchal world, and or from the reflections of males. And I think for us males, it's important to understand, to support this process for females, and allow that process and find our own a new identity, that we don't define ourselves completely by our success with women in the widest sense, right? And
Yeah.
the admiration that we also realize that there is something more to life than just to be the guy that women look up to and that are admired, and thus we are admired by other males because we are successful with women, right, in this still sexist way. And I'm not saying we need to go do away with that. It's ridiculous to say, women should marry unsuccessful loser men, and men should find the physically most unattractive women to have relationship with. That will never happen, right? But we need to become conscious of that and speak of it, and then we can go to this fifth stage, right, where we become real equal and opposite co-creators. So for the listeners who made it that far, and are seriously interested in this, I want to emphasize on understanding that the modern understanding of the anima and animus complex development, that is the most feedback I get on my book, is pointing out these 5 stages in males and females, and then the resources where the research is. So this is my thing is, accept biological differences, have conversations at different levels of consciousness, how these are seen, look at what are learned gender roles that can be transcended, look at the fear shame dynamic that's unconscious and make that conscious, look at what are feminine masculine polarities and the healthy expressions that males and females can both embody and you can synergize, and don't overlook the anima animus complex uh, development in males and females. And I think once that is experienced, right, through exercises, through not just like theorizing about it, but really feeling into it and being really vulnerable about it, uh, then we can, I think, could create totally different company cultures where we move away from equality and just trying to make everyone the same or expecting everyone to be somehow the same, because that will never happen. So let's just accept that, right? And
Yes. Thank you very much, Martin. And if you're interested to explore more of what Martin has been talking about, in integralrelationships.com is where you can be found.
mhm.
Great book. I've only read your first one. Great book. Also on the website, you'll find some really good talks and interviews with Martin talking about these different aspects when it comes to intimate relationships. And with that, thanks so much, Martin, for this
Mhm.
conversation. It
Yeah,
was really nice getting to know you, and
likewise.
have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye bye, everyone.